Yeah, so my name is Oleksandra Wallo, and the book is called Ukrainian Women Writers and the National Imaginary from the Collapse of the USSR to the Euromaidan. It's a book that's been long in the making. I have always been a fan of women's writing and always wanted to work on women's writing. And I noticed as I was reading these works from the 90s and 2000s, as well as from the 1980s, that there was this great discrepancy between even the volume and also the publicity that was, the attention that was given to women's writing in the 1980s as opposed to the era after the collapse of the USSR. And on the one hand, it seems logical. You know, the climate changed, Ukraine became independent, and so the floodgates opened for a lot of interesting publications. But this is not the case in other contexts in Slavic literatures. I'm somewhat familiar with the situation in Russia, for example, and there was a lot of women's prose in Russia before the collapse of the USSR. So I wanted to look at this process, how Ukrainian women authors, especially prose writers, really gained a voice and a place on the literary scene in the 1990s, how that change happened. And so that took me to investigate the 1980s and before, the Soviet context, and then the 2 decades after the collapse of the USSR. The writers that I look at in the book are all from, the 3 main writers are from the generation of Вісімдесятники, the 80s writers. And I look at 3 of them, Oksana Zabuzhko, of course, Marija, Matios, and Yevhenia Kononenko. They come from different parts of Ukraine. They had somewhat different trajectories to literary popularity, but they also share this process of they all 3 of them were born and completed their studies under the Soviet system, and then they started publishing a little bit in the late 1980s, but they really built successful professional writing careers already starting in the 1990s and especially in the 2000s. And so I wanted to look at this almost new generation cohort of women writers that emerged and really paved the way for the younger generations of Ukrainian women prose writers that came after them. And today we have many. It's a real blossoming of Ukrainian women's writing. And to answer your second question about the Ukrainian imaginary, so the way I think of this term is this kind of web of discourses about the nation and what makes a particular national community a community. It's not just discourses, it's also things like symbols, so heroes, monuments, the anthem, the flag, and all of these signposts that unite a community and give it a sense of a unique identity. I wanted this particular term from my book because there have been interesting theories in the West about the reliance of the national imaginary on narratives. And I argue in the book that they especially rely on plots. And so literature, of course, for literature, plots are the bread and butter of what literature does. And I found it very fruitful to look at how the national imaginary is constructed and reconstructed in literature through novelistic plots. So yes, so that's one of the things I really look at in the book very closely. I do compare women's prose writing to some of the their male colleagues writing from the 1990s. So for instance, I compare a novel by Oksana Zabuzhko to a novel by Yuri Andruchovich. And one of my main arguments is that women writers really inserted women's voices into the national story. A lot of these narratives, if not all of them, are centered on a woman character or women characters who are really trying to find a voice. And they want to contribute, they want to tell their own stories, what their lives were like in the national story. They sometimes even critique some elements of the national story, of the national imaginary, and provide important correctives to that. So, for instance, Oksana Zabuzhko is probably the most notorious and also the most famous for doing so. In her novel, Fieldwork in Ukrainian Sex from 1996, she really leaves no stone unturned. She looks at the traumatic past, Soviet past in Ukraine. She looks at how various traumas from the Soviet past have impacted men and women somewhat differently. The character of the novel is a young woman intellectual, a poet who is on a Fulbright scholarship in America. And she is answering all kinds of questions from her Western colleagues about Ukraine, most of whom don't know very much. And the setting is the early 1990s. So most of them don't know anything about Ukraine. She tells them, I'm from Ukraine. They ask, well, where is that? What is it? And so she has to explain and almost like assert both her own existence and the existence of her nation on the map, put it on the map for the rest of the world. And then they ask her about the anthem, Ukrainian anthem. And when she quotes the first line, they cannot understand why it's so pessimistic. Ukraine has not died yet. And so then she has to tell them the backstory, why it's so. And it's a very interesting work that really engages a lot of these ideas, the baggage, the colonial baggage that Ukraine carries to this day, but was especially carrying in the 1990s and was trying to shed. I should say that before I look at the three writers from the Eightiers generation, the Вісімдесятники, I also had to do quite a bit of research on the Soviet era. So one of the writers I look at, her name is Ніна Bichuya. She's from Lviv. She lives in Lviv to this day. I look at her as a precursor to contemporary Ukrainian women prose writers. And I look at her literary career during the Soviet times and try to understand why she never gained greater popularity. And she has a very interesting story because she was one of the very few prose writers, Ukrainian prose writers, women prose writers of the Soviet era. She wrote brilliant works, at least in my estimation and the estimation of some of her Ukrainian critics, but she never gained greater popularity in Ukraine or in Russia or in all of the Soviet Union. She was translated into Russian. Some of her short stories were published in Moscow. At the same time, they were forbidden from being published in Kyiv, in Ukrainian, for example. So I analyze this context for literary production in the Soviet Union and the different treatment that Russian writers received as compared to Ukrainian writers. And then in the Ukrainian context, I look at male writers versus female writers and the various dynamics of censorship and self-censorship even, because Bichuya eventually decided not to publish any more stories, and her last story is actually from 1990. It's called The Stone Master, and I analyze it in detail. So in order to investigate that story, the Soviet context, I went to Lviv, I interviewed Ніна Bichuya, I looked at a lot of periodicals from the era, journal articles, literary newspaper articles, both those published in Moscow, the metropole, as well as those published in Lviv and Kyiv and other places in Ukraine, to really get a feel for the environment and the context, the historical, the social, and political context. And this is going to be a simplification, but the way I look at this, in the 1990s, the women writers were really prose writers, and I should emphasize prose writers because there was some poetry written by women during the Soviet era. The primary example, of course, is Lina Kostenko. But for women prose writers in the 1990s, the key question is, how can I write? As a Ukrainian woman prose writer, how can I write when this tradition of Ukrainian women's prose writing has really been interrupted by the Soviet regime, because there was a vibrant pre-Soviet tradition in Ukraine. We have Lesia Ukrainka, Nataliya, Kobrynska, we have Olha Kobylianska, and many, many brilliant Ukrainian prose writers. And then the Soviet era is really silencing of a lot of this writing. And so in the 1990s, Oksana Zabuzhko in her early prose works, as well as Yevhenia Kononenko in some of her short stories, were really asking this question: how can a Ukrainian woman write and reconstruct this literary tradition that has been broken during the Soviet time? And a lot of these are shorter works. They're more about individual women writers and their struggles. Whereas later on, in the later 1990s and then in the 2000s and even now, their novels especially become much broader in scope. They look at multiple decades of Ukrainian history and culture, and a lot of these novels have several women characters. There is even almost a tradition of these family sagas, right? So I think Oksana Zabuzhko demonstrates that really well with her Museum of Abandoned Secrets from 2009, where she takes 3 generations of Ukrainians, both men and women, but women do really play a bigger role in the novel, and she looks at all different things that they had to go through, politically, culturally, silenced family histories, the struggles of Ukraine under the Soviet regime, as well as in the early post-Soviet era, including issues of corruption, all the struggles that led up to the 2004 Orange Revolution, and how women participated in the public sphere trying to navigate that context. And so then, now after the Euromaidan, I think we have a real explosion of women's writing on a variety of topics. But this trend of multi-generation family sagas, I think, continues. And I don't look at this in the book, because I do end the chronology of the book ends with the Euromaidan, right? That's my ending point, because I had to end somewhere. I'm working on living authors, and they keep writing wonderful things, but I had to end somewhere. But what I see happening now after the Euromaidan is a real variety in women's writing, with kind of more of an emphasis on, again, reconstructing the national history, women's place in that history, women's roles in the nation, and trying to basically fill all of these blind spots and blank pages. I did not expect to find such coincidences in the themes of the short stories and the novels that women were writing in the 1990s and the 2000s. For instance, in the 1990s, both Oksana Zabuzhko and Yevhenia Kononenko published shorter pieces of prose in which they really asked this question: how can a Ukrainian woman write? And in each piece of prose, the central character is a woman poet who is navigating her environment and trying to find a voice in this new environment. To me, that indicated that this was not a one-off. This was really a trend, a question, a cultural question that was important for these women writers to answer for themselves in the 1990s, and basically deal with each element of that label, Ukrainian woman writer, right? So look at what it means to write as a Ukrainian, as a woman, and then how do you write in the early post-Soviet environment with all of the baggage that comes from the Soviet era. Another surprise was really looking at, when I was looking at the Soviet context, I was struck by just the deviousness and the variety of means that were used by the Soviet literary production machine to silence writers. So I looked at both, at this phenomenon of internal reviews, which were reviews commissioned by a publishing house, for example, before the book could be published. And they were never made public. The reviews themselves were never made public, but they were also always used as tools in the Ukrainian context to stop promising young writers, to silence them, to basically stop their work from being published. So that is one element of that context. But then the Soviet machine, all of these big decisions, of course, were made in Moscow. And then they trickled down to the local level. And when I looked at the local level, let's say the Kyiv level, and then the level in the peripheries of Ukraine, there were also interesting discoveries to be made about how these big policies affected writers on the ground, often in very unexpected ways. So in the case of Nina Bichuya, for example, she was invited by a prominent Russian translator to publish in the Russian series, in Russian translation, to be published in that series as the first Ukrainian prose writer. And it wasn't Moscow, but it was Kyiv who said no. Right? Kyiv said no to that publication. They told her that she was too young, she wasn't very well known, and she could not be the first prose writer to represent Ukraine on the all-union literary stage. And so her book was shelved, even though the translation was all complete and ready to go. It did appear later, but not until they published Ukrainian works in Russian translation by more prominent, more established male writers of the period who were safer for the Soviet regime, let's put it that way. Certainly, Oksana, Zabuzhko, Yevhenia, Kononenko, and Maria Matios did have to reinvent women's prose writing in Ukraine in the 1990s when they began. And one way in which they did that was to look back to the pre-Soviet Ukrainian women's writing and engage in dialogue, in intertextual dialogue with writers, Ukrainian women writers such as Lesia, Ukrainka, and Olha, Kobylianska. And they do this in their literature, in their short stories and novellas from the early post-Soviet era, where they either borrow titles from these Ukrainian women modernists and use their titles as their own titles for their own work, or they directly engage in dialogue within the work, and they basically find support in this pre-Soviet tradition of women's prose writing for themselves. And they write themselves into this tradition, sort of bypassing the Soviet era and reconstructing it in such a way. And because they had to do all that work, all that spade work, because there wasn't an unbroken tradition, I think the cost has been steep for the culture, for Ukraine itself, right? There could have been many more Ukrainian women prose writers already working actively in the 1990s. They could be writing on a variety of topics and subjects that don't have to answer basic questions about how does a woman writer write. On the other hand, it's a fascinating story how just within a decade, a smaller group of Ukrainian women writers was able to reinvent themselves, assert themselves on the literary scene, and really open these floodgates for Ukrainian women writers to publish. I pay a lot of attention to the poetics of the texts that I analyze. I look not only at the ideas that these women writers express, but also at how they express them. So I look at their literary form. And what I found is that the form, which often gets ignored in contemporary literary criticism, helps us unlock some of these mysteries, helps us explain what these women are actually thinking about these various issues. For instance, I look at how Ukrainian women writers, these three writers that I mentioned, and plot their novels. Meaning, how do they construct the plot? How do they look at the roles of women in the nation? And they often work against stereotypes about that. And one common stereotype is that in prose work written by male authors, women characters are often used to symbolize the nation. So they become these symbolic figures, larger than themselves in some way, to symbolize either the suffering of the nation or the sanctity of the nation or something like that. Well, the women writers that I look at don't do that. They actually perform the opposite move. They go from the national story to this micro level of individual women's lives. And they rarely treat individual women characters in this mythological light. They just give them the voice, they describe their life stories in great detail, and by doing that, they ascribe value to these common lives and assert this value. So their approach is interesting. It's very different from a lot of the writing about the nation that we see from the previous decades. And it's fascinating to be tracing this also on the level of the literary form, not just the level of ideas. So, for instance, during the Soviet era, if a writer like Nina Bichuya, for instance, was able to freely publish anything that she wanted to publish, both in Kyiv, let's say, and maybe even at the level of the metropole in Moscow, I think we would have fascinating writing about Ukrainian life, daily life, as it was during the Soviet period. And of course, we didn't get that. So because we have so little free writing in the Soviet era, we know very little what these daily lives of generations of women were like in the Soviet era. We know them perhaps from family stories, from what our parents and grandparents told us if we're Ukrainian, were raised in Ukraine. But it hasn't been captured on the pages of Ukrainian women's prose because it just didn't exist at the time as a phenomenon. Thank you very much. Thank you for making the time to do this interview. I really appreciate it. Bye-bye.